Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. Ron, great to have you on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dave.
Yeah. So before I threw on the recorder, we were just chatting a bit. So you're in lovely Medellin, which is a place I still need to make it to. I'm here in New York. I guess before we get into things, I think you have a really interesting sales background. You're doing a lot in the cold outreach space and the podcast space as well. Can you talk a little bit about your background?
Yeah. So I was a financial advisor for 12 years. So I started off selling investments in college. I don't even know if that was legal, but you didn't need a college degree to do it. You just needed to pass the certifications. Went on to run Illinois and Iowa for Farmers Insurance. And then I got tired of that industry. And I was like, you know what? Software seems to be taking off. This is like 2012.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to move out to California. I'm going to go out there and see if I could get into this new SaaS world, and ended up finding that they were building what they call Silicon Prairie in St. Louis, and they were trying to build the St. Louis startup ecosystem. So I became a part of that, and that's where I kind of have been for the last 11 years. I've been in the startup space, working as a consultant on the sales side, and then in 2018, I bought my own company. I bought a failing startup, and that's what I run today.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's funny because I remember that era too, because I kind of fell into a sales job, basically selling explainer video services, right? So we would make those, we were kind of like the Lexus of explainer videos, and I would sell that. It was here in New York, and I just remember how kind of like vibrant and crazy and weird that era was, because this is when people were getting really stupid valuations for bad ideas. And I didn't have that much insight at that time, but even then I was like, some of these ideas made no sense. And I remember going into a WeWork and somebody just being like, saying like, this is going to be so big. The value of this is the data. It's not actually the offices. And I remember thinking like, what data? There's a bunch of like startups buying staplers. Like what, like how is it? I don't know. It was like in the prairie though at that time.
Exactly like that.
Yeah.
Just like that. Same bad time, same bad channel, just a different city,
Yeah.
I mean, because coming from my world, businesses weren't based on their valuation. It wasn't this pro forma, like, hey, 5 years out it's going to be this, 10 years out it's going to be this. It was based on, yo, how much money you make now? Like, how much bread you bringing in? I'm a sales guy. Like, yo, did we make some money today?
Right.
So I would go and make these presentations at these startup pitch competitions, and I would show how much money we made. And then the people that didn't make any money didn't even have an idea would win. And I'm like, I got this all messed up. Like, maybe I'm misunderstanding something. Maybe I should just come with an outrageous idea, and they'll support that versus something that's actually making money.
I think you were right. It's just the time horizon was slightly different. And I think that's what's happening now is the tides, because essentially that era has lasted until pretty much this past year or so, right? That's what it feels like anyway. Yeah.
So I think we see it with everything. Whenever something's new, whether it was Web3 and NFTs a few years ago, everybody was into that. And then before that, it was Bitcoin and all of that. Like these things come in as fads. Everybody rushes in with all of this optimism. And then when reality crashes back down, the ones who are a bit more stable end up surviving, right? So right now we're looking at what's happening with AI, and everybody's rushing in. Everything needs to have AI. Cool. All you're doing is building open AI, building their revenue, because you're building on top of their stuff. And if they happen to do what Twitter did, which is let everybody build all these apps and then cut off the API, once the apps had smartened up Twitter and Twitter found the ones that they wanted, now all those companies that were built on top of the Facebook API, remember there used to be a bunch of Facebook games, like Mafia Wars and Farmland and all. Where's all that stuff now? Gone, right? Facebook gathered the data, what people were interested in, and then they cut off the API. So I think that that's something that we may see with OpenAI down the road if they don't open up an app store or kind of treat it like Apple has done. But we see that exuberance and then die down with every new technology, every new, Web 2 was what we were describing, right? That was Web 2.
Yeah. And I remember that era of Facebook apps, because I guess before that job, I was working for an agency, and that was like our bread and butter at that time was building those Facebook apps, which essentially went away. And yeah, to do a little tangent on Facebook, I think that's what Zuck always wanted. Like he always wanted to be this world builder, like this kind of like Snow Crash kind of guy, right? And that's what he's tried to do now, and it's apparently not working very well. But basically, I guess somewhere after that they realized like, no, we make our money from ads. We're an advertising organization, and that's what they've been up until this recent probably failed experiment with Meta, with the VR stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's kind of backed off of that because they were spending like billions of dollars, and a lot of people were killing him. The guys at the All In podcast, I mean, they were just like, dude, this dude is wasting $200 billion on this stuff with
Yeah.
no ROI. And then OpenAI comes out, and the conversation of the metaverse and NFTs and all the Web3 stuff goes away, especially after what happened with FTX, right? And then now everybody's just AI, Chat GPT. Or you're like, dude, come on, it's can't be
Yeah.
everywhere like that.
I mean, the funny thing about it is like I'll try to keep my eye on the sales apps and the new AI ones and that kind of thing. And there's definitely people doing interesting things with it that are kind of sitting on top of the API with OpenAI. It's a lot of alphabet soup there, API for OpenAI. But anyway, once you dig into a lot of them, though, it's like, oh, this isn't. Some of them aren't tied to OpenAI at all. They're actually just sales tools that are claiming AI status in order to market themselves, which is predictable that would happen. That's always happens. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. People ask me a lot, like, how is AI disrupting sales and all this stuff? And I still think there's this fundamental element of like trust that you need in a big ticket B2B sales situation that's like really hard to get away from, right? So, for example, you can have an AI go run off and do all this stuff for you and make all this messaging for you, but ultimately a human's going to have to be the one on the line in order to build enough trust to sell anything that's above approximately $1,000 or something like that. So that's still really tough to run away from because you'd have to have somebody reviewing all that messaging. And once you have a human involved, it like defeats the purpose of the AI almost. There are exceptions and there are people doing cool stuff, and I'm not brushing it all aside, but that's kind of what I've seen. I'd love to hear your perspective though.
Well, I think AI enhancements, right? I think AI will, and this is kind of a dumb analogy, but it makes sense, right? I have on glasses because I can't see very well. Well, this was a form of AI at one point that
Yeah.
was artificial. I put it on. Now my eyes are definitely stronger, right? So if we were to think of Chat GPT or whatever other apps that are being built on top of it, such as Balto software out of St. Louis, that's a sales enhancement glove that you put on, right?
Yeah.
So when you're running a call center, you want to standardize what everybody's saying on inbound sales calls. Well, Balto allows you to do that because it's listening and it's correcting the salesperson, telling them that they're talking too much, or gives them sentiment analysis, and then it live updates the conversation. So if the top sales guy at the organization is killing it, next week everybody's going to be doing killing it the same way because the AI has updated the scripts for everybody,
Yeah.
right? So that's happening right now. We still need the human to have the conversation because AI voices sound like crap, right?
Yeah.
Until we get like these, like we see people making music with it, right? But that's going to stop too because they're going to copyright people's voices. But I think AI is the glove that people will wear, just like I wear glasses to enhance my eyesight. There will be an AI layer that will be that augmented reality layer that everybody's been talking about.
Right.
It'll just be AI reinforced. And just like in this conversation right now, I have a thing that tells me how long I've been talking if I need to let you come in. I mean, it's literally right on my screen
It's
right
funny
now.
because I have that too, not on right now, but with Fathom, I think, or one of the others. I'm sure there's others that do the same thing. But I'm always wondering, like, what is that based on, and what's the point of it? It's like, what if I just want to ramble? It's my show, right? Yeah,
I think that it works. I
yeah,
think especially for sentiment,
yeah,
right? Because we really don't hear how aggressive we are sometimes,
right.
right? And
But what if
depending
I
on who
want to
you're
yell
used
at
to,
you? What if I'm mad at you, Ron? Like, why do I want the
yeah, I think
AI
that that's
trying to
fine.
control me?
But if that's not my intention, I probably should be communicating that.
Right.
And I think that that's what it does. I don't think it's there as a corrector. I think it's there as a guideline. So I can look at that and say, "Holy crap, I am being a bit aggressive. Let me back off a little bit." Right. Or maybe I'm being a bit too passive in this sales conversation. Maybe I need to challenge Dan and take action because I've
Right.
just been listening to him. So it's not that it's saying that I'm right or wrong. it's giving me the feedback so that I can make the decision, right?
Yeah.
I think that that's what I'm describing, not this thing where it's already understanding that. I think we as humans still have some judgment to add to it.
Yeah, I think that if it's like in a very limited domain and there's a massive data set and it's kind of thinking in broad strokes, I could see that being useful. Like if you have a situation where it's something very basic, like we've analyzed this many thousands of sales conversations for this specific product in this specific organization with this one specific buyer group, and we found that the deals that close have this percentage of talking from salesperson versus prospect. I could see that being pretty effective. I think where it gets iffy is every other situation where there's small data sets, too many variables, it's too changing, etc. That's where I'm like, all right, I don't know what this means. I don't know what to do with this information.
Well, I think most like PSS, I think Miller Hyman is the company that owns it now. It used to be called Achieve Global, right?
Mhm.
And they have the professional selling skills. Well, that model was based upon percentages, right? You should only be talking like 20% at the beginning and then like 60 to 70% at the end when you're closing.
Yeah.
We just had no way to measure it. Now, with this voice listening and virtual calls, we can actually measure it to see, did I follow the questions? Did I do the correct opening? Did I do the correct qualifying? The AI can tell me if I'm doing it right or not. And we know sales compliance to scripts is terrible for
Yeah.
most companies. So if they can improve that, I think it works, man.
Yeah, and I think to speak to our audience a little bit, they're definitely in a bigger ticket, long sales cycle, consultative sales cycle, multiple stakeholders, and that's where I think the data can be useful, but it often gets very muddy because you're just dealing with, more variables than more transactional sales where there's just the same thing over and over. I hopefully bring that to a question, but I guess what have you learned in that context? Like what are some of those sales lessons that you still think are really valuable?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the sales tools are important, like CRMs and things like that. And CRMs were invented for managers to watch over the salespeople, right? There's never been a CRM that was actually made for salespeople. And because the manager, hey, track your stuff so I can give a report to know if you're doing what you're saying you're doing. Well, now with Zoom calls and I don't have to enter any notes anymore. When the meeting is set, it's automatically put into my CRM. Well, that's a huge thing for salespeople because it removed our data entry.
Right.
I don't have to enter data anymore because I got notes after this. It just goes in there. My case notes, if I was a financial planner, again, now I have all the compliant things to make sure I'm not getting sued. So I think that those types of enhancements are going to be incredible, right? I think that we'll see great tools that people can use to wear as a set of glasses, not as a replacement for them, but it's going to empower them and give them an advantage over everyone else.
Yeah, I think you're generally right. I guess we're like live questions is like we've already have too much information and too much data that's potentially useful. The problem is parsing it and finding out and prioritizing it. And we'll have to see how much AI can help with that. I guess it's a bit devil's in the details as usual. So that all makes sense. To bounce back a little bit, so you talked about buying a company in 2018, which I think is really interesting. That's not always the route you see. A lot of the times people are like, well, I was good at baking, so I started a bakery or, whatever that is. What made you go in that direction?
Well, because one of the things I learned is that I could buy something easier than what I could start something. So when you go to the analogy I like to use is an apartment building. Imagine that there's a 100-unit apartment building and it has a 3-year waiting list, right? But across the street, there's a vacant lot. And I go to the bank and I say, hey, I want to build an exact replica of the apartment building that's on this side of the street to take up that 3-year waiting list because all those people can come live in my building. And the bank will ask me some very simple questions. Who's the developer? Who's going to design the building? Who's going to do all of these things? Well, as a startup, you're saying, well, me and one of my buddies. And they're like, no, we're not going to loan you $5 million to go build something and you don't know drywall, you don't know plumbing, you don't know any of this stuff, excavating, any of that, right? But if a week later I was driving down the same street and I saw an old lady outside crying because her husband passed away, and I said, hey, what's wrong? Are you okay? And she's like, yeah, my husband just passed away. We own this building. I live in Europe now. I need to sell it. It's just hard for me to think about this. I give her my card. I get her card. I go back to the same bank and say, hey, you know that building I told you about? And the guy's like, man, we're not giving you the money for your goofy startup idea. No, no, no. That building's for sale. Really, bring in the financials. Right now, they'll give me a loan for the same $5 million to buy the existing apartment building, but they wouldn't give me the same $5 million to build a competitor.
Yeah.
Right. So that's buying a business versus starting one. The drywall's already there, the plumbing, all of the things are already in place in that apartment building. Where when you buy a business, the product is in place, the employees are in place, the marketing and the sales systems, the operations are in place already. So the bank is buying the history where they loan you the money. So once I figured that out, I said, oh, holy crap, I should never start anything ever again, because I actually found it to be cheaper as far as an investment point of view for me to buy a business than what it was to start one, because it was
Yeah.
less capital outflow at the beginning, because the bank would actually loan me the money and not take an equity position. Where if I go raise startup funds, they're going to take an equity position, and I got to go back begging from them every year to get another $2 million for them to take another 20% of my company. So buying is the easiest way, in my opinion.
That makes a lot of sense. And can you talk about that process? How did you go about finding that business and landing on what you ultimately bought?
Yeah. So actually, the particular business that I bought was a company out of Austin, Texas called Lead Pilot. And I was looking for, we were doing cold outreach at the time manually, right? So we had a Python scraper that would scrape web pages and take email addresses off. And I was looking for a sending platform. I found this one, went to sign up for it, and got a you can't log in, we're not working page. So I hit the guy up on Twitter and I'm like, yo, hey man, when I went to sign up, it gave me this what we call an Nginx page. And he was like, yeah, I shut it down. It's not publicly available. I use it whenever I need to, but I'm a developer. I don't know how to sell this stuff. What? So 2 weeks later, it was an asset purchase. I purchased 250 million email contacts, all attached to the LinkedIn profile of the person, along with the shell of a software product. Yeah, so that's how I found it. It wasn't like I did anything special through a broker. I guess in real estate, they would call it a pocket deal. It was just a house that I walked down the street, knocked on the door, and they were like, yeah, we'll sell it to you. That's what happened.
Yeah. So you just kind of stumbled across this through scraping through Python, or can you talk about that again? How you found it?
Yeah, yeah. No, I did a Google search. Hey,
Yeah.
cold email sending software. At the
Yeah.
time, there was only one called Mailshake.
Yeah.
And I think it was called Connector IO at the time, right? So I was just looking for different alternatives to Mailshake. And I saw this one that had leads in it already. So
Got it.
it was Mailshake with leads,
Ah, okay. So it's
right?
kind of like GrowBots back in the day or whatever, but bigger
Yeah,
maybe.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly,
Cool.
right? But the guy was a developer who didn't know how to grow a business. And
Yeah.
that's normal. It's a conversation we used to have where I used to say, hey, I can't code, but you can't sell. So
Yeah.
we should be friends so that we can kind of make this work, because
Well,
both hands need each other.
yeah, to do a little sidebar on that, I feel like the paradigm's kind of flipped a little bit, like going back to the 2010s or whatever, back to that era. Developers felt like they had a lot more leverage and clout back then, and now I feel like it's flipped. Now I feel like if you want to get something built, it's extremely commoditized, very cheap, very easy overall to get that thing built. The hard thing is having the gumption to do it and then being able to sell it and validate it, right? So if anything, I feel like more leverage has gone to the salespeople and others in the sales marketing silo, right? What's your take on that, though?
Yeah, yeah, no, I 100% agree. If you have an audience, you have a huge opportunity. Look at what's happened with, The Rock. The
Yeah,
Rock has 300 million people follow him. He launches Terramana Tequila, and he's one of the biggest tequila brands in the world because he already had an audience.
right.
So if I think that the future belongs to those who have an audience. So if you have an audience of people that are listening to you, you can get the tech built, because there's a lot of no code stuff that you can drag and drop yourself. And in a month, without knowing how to code, you can build an application, right? You
Yeah,
can build what they call a CRUD app. CRUD is like create, retrieve, update, and delete, right?
yeah,
If your basic app just needs to do those four things, you could do that with drag and drop stuff now, no code builders. But if you have an audience of 40,000 people, boom, like you can drop that into that. And I'll give you an example. We did a deal with another company to kind of take a custom version of our outreach software. He's grown in 4 weeks what took me like a year and a half to get to, right?
Yeah.
Because he had an audience of people. I didn't have an audience.
Right.
He just sent one email and, you know, so I definitely know that those who have an audience have an advantage nowadays.
Yeah, and it's not just the audience either. It's how you're marketing to them, how often, the relationship, and all these things that are harder to measure, but they're definitely real. Otherwise, you could just have a list, and blast the list, which we all know isn't enough.
Well, I mean, I don't think a
Yeah.
list is an audience,
Right.
right? I own
Yeah.
250 million people's email addresses. That ain't my audience.
Yeah. Totally.
I
Yeah.
just got a list. Like everybody used to have phone books back in the day, but that
Yeah.
didn't mean that you had a book of leads. You had a list of strangers. When I
Yeah.
say audience, I mean somebody who is connected with you, that follow you on your pages, they're engaging with your content. It's a permission-based audience. That's what I meant to say.
Correct. Yeah. And I think not exactly the same as that, but kind of tied to that, we're doing, essentially lots of outreach for people to keep the pipeline full, as I know you are too. And I think one of the biggest things I see is that, I'll talk to people, they're like, we did a bunch of outreach, you either hired somebody or we did it ourselves, and it just didn't work. We got nothing, got horrible meetings. And then we'll kind of dig into things. And then usually what I'll see is that everybody's just kind of going in cold and selling stuff and saying, here are my case studies, here's my collateral. Can I sell you? And the problem with that is I actually think there was an era where it worked better because things were more novel and there was less competition or whatever, and there's less competition for attention. But I think the main thing that's happened now is the resource that's scarce is trust, right? All these things, all these solutions, whether it's software, services, agency services, people kind of get what they do. The hard thing is finding that trust. So that's the thing we're always working on is how do we shortcut the trust that you'd have in a real relationship with people that are on the outer rim of that, that are in these circles of influence that are beyond the people, but not 5 steps beyond, maybe like 1 step beyond. But with that, I'd love to hear what's working for you. Like what are you seeing out there these days?
Yeah, I think you just hit it on the head, man. A lot of times when I get clients that come to me and say, hey, can you just send out this link and just tell people to sign up for my webinar? And I'm
Yeah.
like, no. And they're like, well, why not? I'm like, because that's stupid.
They won't
like,
do it.
It's
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're just gonna be mad at me when they don't sign up, right? So I say, well, look, why don't you do this? Why don't you like make a list of 200 of the people you want to come to your thing? Like, give me a list and let's reach out to them and set up intro calls for you. Well, no, I don't want to meet with anyone. Cool. Well, you got the wrong person. I set up meetings, bro. I don't send people to a link. I reach out to people because the person on the other side actually cares about them. Actually cares about growing their business, actually wants to help the other side. So if you don't want to meet with someone, then just go run Facebook ads to your little click link and Google interest-based ads, whatever. But don't do cold email because the medium of reaching out via cold email is so personal that if you give them an impersonal response, they're not going to respond to you ever. Right? And then they're going to mark you as spam because they're like, this person was just being selfish. So I totally believe that there's a lot of people who are just, they say that they're doing cold outreach, but they're just spamming, right?
Yeah.
There's just spamming. That's not cool.
Right. And I think a lot of times when we take on new clients, we'll get asked like, well, should this come from the CEO? Will we get more responses if it comes from this more senior person on the team? And I'll say yes, but does that person have the time and motivation to be getting on all of those calls and then being involved in that sales process, right? And the answer is usually no. So I'm like, let's not do it from that person. We'll make it work from somebody else. So that's important. So Ron, I think one thing you mentioned just then is webinars, and I hear lots of different opinions on webinars, and I'm wondering like, what's your thought on them these days? Are you bullish? Are you bearish? Are we in the Netflix era where on demand is everybody just wants that? How much value is there to the live component? To be honest, I've done webinars a long time ago that have gone really well. More recently, the last ones I've done have just been crickets. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. There's a lot of work for it to not work out. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, so I'm not a big producer of webinars
Yeah.
because I hate them myself.
Yeah.
So I try to think that, and it's probably a mistake and it's probably hurt me a lot, but I think everybody's like me, right? It's like, dude, do I really want to I got stuff to do in the middle of the day. You're going to tell me at 1 p.m. tomorrow, you're going to do this webinar for 2 hours where it's going to be 15 minutes of value and 3 hours of you trying to pitch me your $9.99 course. I really don't want to go to it. Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of the things that I think people have kind of gone down on webinars because they're not as educational as they used to be. They're just a 3 hour pitch fest now.
Yeah.
And it's like, dude, I don't want to sign up for that. I can learn all the things you're going to put on there on your social. I can just go to your Instagram and watch your videos on Instagram and learn the same things.
Yeah.
Or if you have a YouTube channel. So I'm not a big fan of webinars, but there's a lot of guys out there that are killing it with webinars. I think on demand is the best way to go because if I'm up at 2 in the morning and I'm looking for something, I want to be able to find that thing. I've bought a lot of courses off of like Udemy or things like that because I needed to learn this particular thing. So I could just go to Udemy and buy that $13 solution and it solved my problem. It didn't make me wait until Friday at 2 p.m. to get the answer that I needed.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. And to shift gears a little bit, can you talk about what you're doing with PitchDB and so on?
Yeah, so PitchDB is basically a place where anybody who has a perspective, whether you're a coach, a speaker, an entrepreneur, an author, if you have a perspective that you want to get out to the world, you can hop on to PitchDB and pitch over 3 million podcasters, over 140,000 local industry associations that have conferences, and over 38,000 media contacts. So you can get on whatever platform you need to with your message. If that's getting on a podcast like now, you just send them an email saying, hey, Dan, I love your show. Would love to come on and talk about, this, and that. I heard Ron on there, whatever. Send your pitch. You do that that's what we help people to do with PitchDB.
That's very cool. And what are the sorts of businesses you're seeing have the most success with it, and how are they kind of using it the best way from what you've seen?
Yeah, so I think that businesses, the best people that we focus on are coaches. Why? Because coaches already know what they're communicating,
Yeah.
right? And most of the folks that are listening to business podcasts probably have dealt with some type of coach or something in the past already, right? So if you're a coach and you know that your message is impactful, a podcast is really an audio webinar. If you come on and you add value and the person can watch it whenever they want, but it's a referral. So
Yeah.
Dan, right now, you're referring me to your audience because based on a previous conversation, you trusted that I wasn't going to embarrass you in this conversation, right? So when a podcast host has you on the show, he's trusting you and your message to introduce that to his audience. So I think any coach who needs to be tried out before the person buys them, the best way to let people try you on is to get out there and help people via podcast.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And to put myself in the shoes of some of our audience, we work with lots of agencies, some of which have been around for years, sometimes decades, sometimes they're many millions of dollars ahead of where we are, very successful organizations. But I'll talk to the owners, and I think there's still a lot of anxiety or hand wringing about what am I going to say? What's my perspective? Even though there's this kind of imposter syndrome is kind of an exaggeration, but it's more like, it's just not like the knife's not sharp enough yet. There's a lot of like hand wringing about how to develop that perspective so it's sharp enough to go talk about it on XYZ industry podcasts. So do you have any advice for that situation?
Yeah. In the past, the world used to be controlled by megaphone, ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, right? Nowadays, the world is controlled by microphones. So I don't need to have this broad Oprah message that 5 million people need to enjoy. I need to have a very specific message that my people need to enjoy. So I go on podcasts that I believe that I can speak a very specific language to about coaches or agency owners or entrepreneurs that are like me, because that's who I can help the best. I help myself first, and then I help everyone else based on what I learned. So I just really go on and share stories about what I'm doing. That's all you need to do. So you don't need to be a genius. You need to be authentic. So just talk about your real experiences while you're on a podcast. Who cares if somebody's bigger than you and they don't relate to what you're talking about? Somebody in that audience relates to exactly where you are in your business. They want to work with your agency. They want you to be their coach. Everyone else, you should really be repelling, right? So some people will listen to this today and they won't like what I'm saying, but 5 of them will listen and say, man, I like this guy, Ron. I want to try out his PitchDB thing. Perfect. I won. Right. So I'm not trying to be an expert. I'm trying to be authentic. And the way that way that everybody can be authentic is tell real stories about stuff that you've done. Leave the theory to the theorist. But if you're an agency owner, you're actually doing stuff. Talk about what you've done. That gets you over the imposter syndrome because you actually did it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's pretty straightforward and good advice for sure. And I guess with that in mind, kind of getting towards the end of our time, what are you working on now? Like, what are you excited about? What's the next big project?
Yeah. So what I've learned, even with PitchDB, right, what we're doing with that, I think that OpenAI can help us out a bit. So we're going to be trying to build a unique layer inside of that, but also just working on building a larger audience, man. More people that I think I can help more directly through trying to build a community around the software instead of pushing the software out there and nobody really knows about it. But building a community of helping people and then saying, hey, the tool can accelerate the help that I'm already giving you. So that's really what I'm
Yeah.
working on now. Trying to build those relationships, man. I'm trying to be like Dad.
No, I could be better too. And with that, and this I should probably know this, but do you guys have a podcast as well? And if not, is that something you're thinking about?
Yeah, I've recorded over 200 podcast episodes, but I never published it.
Yeah.
And part of it was that imposter syndrome that you were talking about. I never thought I was good enough.
Yeah.
Right. So as an interviewer, I may be better as an interviewee, but I never thought I was good enough as an interviewer. So I never put that podcast out. So people have been kind of kicking me in the butt to publish it. So probably within the next 30 to 90 days, we will put out that podcast. I have some very interesting interviews with entrepreneurs like John Lee Dumas. I interviewed him back in 2014 before he was the JLD entrepreneurial fire guy, but
Yeah.
he had the same message. He's had the same consistent message for 9 years.
Yeah. It's impressive.
And it just shows that if you just stay consistent, if you have the goods, you just stay consistent with it, you can do some great things. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Takes a
I
lot of
have a lot of
discipline.
interviews with people before they were stars.
That's great. Yeah, I think that would be, in some ways that's almost like a blessing in disguise because you can do this interesting sort of hindsight show and start from the
Yeah.
beginning. So that's
I
kind
never
of
thought
cool.
about that. I'm gonna take that idea. I didn't think about
Yeah,
it. Doing like maybe it should be called like 2020 hindsight, and we look back at
there you go.
people.
Yeah. Just
Yeah,
give me
yeah,
10%
I
and
have an
we'll be
example.
good. No, I'm just I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, it's definitely a tortoise in the hare kind of deal. So that's cool.
Yeah,
Yeah. This was so much fun, man. And we're gonna get all this linked up and let's hopefully do it again. Really appreciate it.
yeah. Thanks for having me, man.